From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mildura. What a great time we had. Back in the man cave right now, and we've got plenty to say tonight. Great panel, great debate. We'll get to that in a moment or two's time. 9 days since Australia had its say on the referendum, and I'll be honest, at the start of the second week after it, I wasn't expecting to talk about it, let alone talking about it at the start of the show. Of course, the result remains exactly the same as it was, despite the fact that the postal votes start to trickle in. 60.6% of people said no, none of the states voted yes. If it was an election, only 29 of 151 seats ended up voting yes. But I start today because a collection of Indigenous leaders have decided to sign a letter, well, anonymously, so I don't know how they sign an anonymous letter, but a significant number of people behind the start of the Yes campaign, not the wider Yes campaign that Australians had their judgment on, well, they have now reacted to what happened about a week ago, with Indigenous groups vowing to be heard. Put simply, they are now promising to create their own version of The Voice. It'll have the legal representation that, say, the Tent Embassy does out the front of the old Parliament House. It'll be as official as the Climate Council that was able to constitute itself with private money after it was removed under the Abbott government in 2013. But here we go. We accept that the majority of non-Indigenous voting Australians have rejected recognition in the Australian Constitution. We do not for one moment accept that this country is not ours. So we're now starting to move exactly where I said, towards the Aboriginal sovereignty movement and more of a Lydia Thorpe way of viewing things than the one that has been discussed of many months. It is the legitimacy of the non-Indigenous occupation in this country that requires recognition, not the other way around. Our sovereignty has never been ceded. Now again, I can't tell you exactly who is behind all of this, apart from, supposedly, the core group at the heart of the Yes campaign that was defeated. Now, that core group, which does not represent everyone that was involved in the Yes camp, is clearly far more radical than they ever presented themselves to be in the past 18 months, and Australians, well, they could sniff it out. From everything that they saw Thomas Mayo saying through to, you name it, of people who believe that this would be some sort of a battering ram rather than some area of accountability. They continue. We want to talk with our people and our supporters about establishing, independent of the Constitution or legislation, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander voice to take up the cause of justice for our people. So they're going to make up their own voice anyway. I repeat, it will not be recognised by the Parliament, it will not be funded by the Australian taxpayer, but will this group end up having far more of a say than the Australian people elected them not to have by rejecting the voice the best part of 9 days ago? Now, until we start to know who's formally behind this, then we can start to work out what happens next. But can you think of any other scenario? Let's imagine that there were a collection of people who voted against same-sex marriage, and this was a response to the majority of the country, soundly in every state, saying that same-sex marriage should be illegal. What would we say to the council of priests, imams, or anyone else who wanted to set up something in complete opposite to what the Australian people had voted for? Well, of course, you wouldn't cop it. But get ready for this one, because plenty of people have been around today, at least reacting in part to this key message, that despite the fact you voted against it, it looks like there's going to be an unofficial voice anyway, and it'll be far wilder than the one that was on the table just a couple of weeks ago.
I think you can understand that, particularly for First Nations leaders who've been fighting for this for well over a decade, that there's a lot of hurt and disappointment about the result of the referendum. We've accepted the result, and what we want to do now is work with Indigenous people and all Australians about how we can close the gap. We need to have some more bipartisanship on display.
What is the government's position on the statement?
You want me to tell you what our position is now?
Well, you can tell me. You don't have a position yet if you like. The Prime Minister's indicated he'll be interested to hear from Indigenous leaders on their perspectives.
Can we go back to what they said? Because the statement is far more combative than anything that was said on referendum night, and definitely anything that was said in the lead-up to the referendum. They accepted the majority of voting Australians rejected it. We do not for one moment accept that this country is not ours. That's Lydia Thorpe talk. It is the legitimacy of the non-Indigenous occupation in this country, again, Lydia Thorpe talk, that requires recognition, not the other way around. So the question itself being posed. Now, whether these people were always on the progressive no, or they have moved from the compromise yes to the progressive no, our sovereignty has never been ceded. We want to walk We want to talk to our people and our supporters about establishing an independent of the constitutional legislation. They're going to set up their own voice anyway. This is the Lydia Thorpe way of doing things. Meantime, an interesting play out of New South Wales as they start to discuss the treaty situation in Queensland, because both parties aren't going to say yes to it. It's off the table pretty much for the foreseeable future. In Victoria, they're pushing ahead anyway. And in New South Wales, the position is not now, but after the next state election. Now, Chris Minns did win that election quite handsomely. He will have a little bit of a backbench to burn. But interestingly, this is what he said about this move, where he will try to get an express mandate from the people, knowing up front that vote Minns in 2029 or whatever it is, it will actually be the opportunity to move forward with a treaty.
Haven't begun talks with First Nations people, primarily because they were so focused on on the voice referendum of 2 weeks ago, and that's been their focus and drive and direction. So we need to get around the table and talk to them. But I'm not announcing any changes to New South Wales in the face of the voice being defeated at the constitutional level 2 weeks ago. All I'm saying is that we've got to have progress and we've got to have meaningful dialogue. And I think a lot of people, even a lot of people that voted no, would suggest that that's a good thing. I can't promise progress in relation to this. I can only promise a start. And I'm not trying to be coy. The reason for that is some states have started this treaty process and it's gone on for years and years. And in New South Wales, we'd have to do over 150 different treaties because there's that many different nations.
Next state election's 2028. Yes, we're already talking about another election that far down the track, but he's a brave man because New South Wales made it very clear that they didn't like the idea that was being put on the table. Now, the far more radical, let's just start our own voice, is going to push this thing into a different place. 60% of New South Wales didn't vote for the recognition or the establishment of the voice. What do you reckon their position's going to be on treaty, let alone 150 of them? In part, here's what Warren Mundine had to say about a lot of things today.
I also saw the statement that came out overnight. It is a disgraceful attack on Australia and Australian people. And Albanese was captured by that group because he ploughed ahead at thinking that this was the right way to go. Well, it wasn't.
Meantime, another example of somebody who's telling you up front what their plan is, and normally you can ignore a Green from being able to win high office in the country, but the southeast of Queensland, and particularly the central part of Brisbane, is getting greener by the day. Multiple state seats, multiple federal seats mean there is a good chance that this bloke, Jonathan Shree, you may remember him, the one who said that they shouldn't have fighter jets during River Fire. He's had plenty of things to say. He is about as wild as the Greens can get. And he is saying that if he becomes the next Lord Mayor of Brisbane, he is the Greens candidate. And I repeat, state and federal seats show that there's an awful lot of Greens voters. This is a serious chance. He's saying that the Brisbane Council will end up paying the rent. Quote, I'm deeply concerned about how undemocratic our current council administration is. I think we need to rebuild democracy from the bottom up. I want to spread this idea of paying the rent through my campaign. I repeat, Brisbane is a place that changes, well, by the month because the number of people that, certainly during COVID, fled places like the inner parts of Sydney and Melbourne. It's on its way towards the 2032 Olympics, but the politics of inner Brisbane is getting greener by the year. They won plenty of state seats, plenty of federal seats. My expectation is that it'll get even greener in the next little while. So watch this space, whether the pay the rent guy ends up becoming the next Lord Mayor of Brisbane. Currently a Liberal, but the former member for Brisbane was a Liberal. They just jumped straight past Labor and went full green. Watch this space. Now we know what the Prime Minister's true priority has been for the past many months, and it has been about trying to get himself into the history books by doing what he believed to be right, but Australia believed was not the right idea, and that, of course, was campaigning for the voice. But all along, every night, every week, every month, we've talked about the number one issue in the country, that being cost of living. And surprise, surprise, yet another poll proves that, well, dare I say, we were right. What you have been living, what you have been talking about, what we have been seeing with our own eyes when we live amongst normal people in the suburbs or we go into regional areas to do our town, is that this is the A1 issue. In fact, it's getting even more attention. According to Financial Review and a survey that they do with JWS Research, the number one priority for the federal government should be cost of living, then hospitals, then housing, then the economy, and then you start to get into climate change and energy, but they're just at 32% of people's priorities. It's gone from 75% priority to 81%'s number one priority in the country is cost of living. But where is the Prime Minister? Well, of course, he's overseas. He's about to go meet with Aussie Joe Biden, Airbus Albo, I like that one. He's going to be making his way over there, as Chris Kenny put it out before. He's been on plenty of trips, all of which, of course, desperately important. You notice, by the way, that he went to Ukraine, but he didn't end up going to, he won't be going to Israel. Yeah, not quite the photo opportunity for Twitter, I imagine. But the reality here is that while he's going to be gallivanting around the world, and you know the rules is he doesn't talk about domestic politics when he's overseas, which means for the next couple of weeks he won't have to talk about cost of living, but you keep living it. In fact, right now there is reports that some people in Australia are paying $100 out of pocket to go to the GP. $100 to go to the GP. What was the promise the Prime Minister made when he wasn't the Prime Minister?
We know that the price of medications has gone up under the Morrison government, just like the cost to see a doctor has gone up. Medicare will always be stronger under Labor.
Well, Medicare might be fine, but the actual people who can't use it to bulk bill to see a doctor are now spending $100 to see a doctor, particularly in regional areas. And again, I'm sorry to pat ourselves on the back, but you know how we've been talking about petrol for the past little while and about how this is an area of inflation that is going to affect interest rates and that are most likely going to lead to the 12th interest rate rise, if not next month, probably the one after. But it is ripping at 3 times higher than the average inflation rate. Remember, we've been talking about that. None of the other 6PMs talk about this, 23 hours a day, but barely this is discussed because it's an inconvenience to the Prime Minister. Now, remember, this thing is going to hurt inflation. And guess what they admitted today? Exactly what we've been saying on this show for months. That petrol, which is the blood that goes through the veins of the supply chain of the country, is costing too much, and that's going to affect inflation. But of course, this government has an opportunity. They can do it tomorrow. To cut it by 25 cents a litre. They could cut it by 50 cents a litre, and that would cost $6 billion. 25 cents a litre for 6 months would cost $3 billion. Remember, this is a government that has a $20 billion surplus, but they won't spend a cent of it on doing something that would bring down a cost and potentially put off another interest rate. But supposedly they're the people who care about cost of living. They've learnt their lesson after the referendum. Well, that's garbage, and you know it. And despite the fact that the Prime Minister is in full position and has more money in the kitty than they ever expected, he's got $20 billion extra in a surplus. That's after all of their wild spending. $20 billion in the kitty. $3 billion is 25 cents for 6 months. $6 billion is 25 cents for 6 months. Sorry, for 12 months. But what does the Prime Minister say on that?
Prime Minister, will the government consider slashing the fuel excise now that petrol's above $2 a litre?
Well, we don't make tax policy on the run.
Now, I repeat, they are proud of themselves that they have been able to put together a surplus because they know that people who barely pay attention say surplus good, deficit bad, please vote Labor, we've got an excellent record on the economy. Despite the fact that how many times, how many nights I've listed for you here in chapter and verse, let alone what you live every single night, is the true effect of Albo and Chalmers in charge. Here is Jim Chalmers patting himself on the back for having $20 billion more and not spending a cent to cut fuel taxes.
Surplus. 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 The biggest surplus ever. Surplus. Surplus. A surplus. A bigger surplus. 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 A stronger surplus. Surplus. Surplus.
Deliver that surplus.
And then there is this news. A despicable indictment on a federal government that has $20 billion extra that it is just going to play on politics. The number of Australians who cannot put food on the table is now hitting record highs. Higher than it was in the pandemic, higher than it was in the GFC. According to Food Bank, the excellent, wonderful, amazing charity that puts food on people's table, 3.7 million households in Australia have struggled to put food on the table this year. Pay attention, Albo. Pay attention, Prime Minister's office. I know you watch this show because you're more than happy to pick up the phone and dib-a-dob on it. What is your excuse for why 3.7 million people in this country, households in this country, can't put food on the table when you've got $20 billion extra? Now, I know that if you cut a cheque to 1 million people of $1,000, well, it ends up being an awful lot of money. But there's nothing to say that tonight you couldn't end up giving a couple of $100 extra million to Food Bank tomorrow to make sure that people who need the food get it. Don't forget the stories from the cost of living inquiry in Perth. Remember the stories of people who end up trying to get frozen water. So firstly, they can cool the food that they keep in their car, which is where they live, but then slowly but surely, as it melts, it's a source of drinking water. That's the reality of Albo's Australia, the oh so compassionate, the one who was crying in the dirt, the one who claims to remember every single day that he grew up in the Housing Commission projects of Sydney. Well, the millions of people around this country who are hurting and who are suffering could be helped but are not, deliberately, by a choice of this mob. Now, as for one of the reasons why people are having such a struggle right now, guess what it might be? The cost of food itself. 79% of people that have been involved in something from Food Bank are saying the cost of the food itself is the reason why they can't afford to put it on their bloody table. Yet the Prime Minister, you watch him in the next few days gallivanting around, promising hundreds of billions of dollars to the military-industrial complex with submarines from the United States, promising money for Ukraine, this war, that war, and he's got $20 billion more, a surplus, but he won't cut your fuel taxes and he won't help feed people in this country. Oh, but he apparently now cares about cost of living. He has the money to show he cares. He could cut the tax tomorrow, he could help Food Bank tomorrow as well. But of course, you can't ask him any questions about any domestic matters because he's now overseas. Let's see how much of the compliant media will follow on with that rule, or will actually ask him about his plan for 3.7 million people in Australia who are having trouble. That's households, it's more than people. 2 parents, 2 kids, maybe more kids. It's an outrage, it truly is. Meantime, speaking about other people's money and how the front end of the plane or the private plane ends up spending your money. Remember Dr. Jeanette Young? She was the former Chief Health Officer of Queensland, one of the team who kept you safe during COVID, told you which vaccine was okay and which one wasn't, the one who was more than happy to turn away family members from being able to meet their family members that were dying, the one who said that the lady had to suit up like she was going into some sort of nuclear site to be able to see her dead father's body. The woman who had a system where we literally had to raise money so kids could see their dying father. Well, that piece of work, of course, became the Governor of Queensland, rewarded for all of her incredible work during the pandemic. When Queen Palaszczuk decided, you know what, I'll put you in the position where you are now in charge of all affairs in Queensland. Well, well done to the Brisbane Times today, the Channel 9 newspaper there, which is online, because they've been able to go through an annual report of the Governor. Guess what she's piddling your money away on? Plenty of trips, including one which took her to London. Let me read from their news site today. 3.7 million people households who can't eat. But she spent $360,000 on travel, which included trips to Europe, full cost accommodation, and itineraries, though, must be kept secret. Because the same rules that apply to her apply to the Defence Minister, who can rack up millions of dollars in private jets. Oh, but they care about cost of living, these people. They care about the little people. This, Sheila, literally oversaw a system that meant people were not next to the people they loved as they died. She, along with the Premier, presided over a border system that meant that a woman who had twins lost one of those babies because Queensland hospitals are for Queensland people. Continue, please. Young and her husband made 2 vice-regal trips overseas in the years 22-23. It added up to an awful lot of money, and the purpose was promoting Queensland. What is she promoting in Queensland? Who is she walking up to? Random members of the public in Stoke-on-Kent? Is she going to football matches in Grimsby and handing out first-class tickets to the Gold Coast? Of course she wasn't. Unlike Queensland Government ministers who have strict transparency requirements, the Governor does not publish detailed information about the overseas trips, her accommodation, or what she does day to day. I repeat, this woman who got elevated to being the Governor of Queensland broke thousands of Queenslanders. Now, while the extreme majority of people have forgotten and moved on, never forget Father's Day. Remember Father's Day? When the people of Coolangatta had Father's Day with the people of Tweed Heads over a bloody barrier. Now, we also learned that she spent $35,000 on the upkeep of her Rolls-Royce, a Lexus and a Mercedes-Benz. The annual report says the governor spent $56,000 on flowers and $32,000 on a pool covering. Oh, but cost of living, these people couldn't care less. Once they slide their way up the pole, they don't even bother looking back. That is her reward for what she did to Queensland. Well, forever shame on her and shame on the Queensland government. At the first chance you get, flick them, get rid of them. Now, another issue that I talk about a lot on the show is the problems with our education system. Now, yes, it's too woke and there's way too much lefty programming that goes on, but the reality is that the basics of our system are not working. We've spent more than $300 billion, repeat, $300 billion on the education system over the past 15, 20 years. What's the result now in 2023? A third of kids are behind on their learning. They fail the basics of reading, writing, comprehension and mathematics. Now, we have long said on this show that despite the fact that the Gonski report, the Gillard era, the promises of the former government, it's not about more money, it's about greater discipline. The reality is that our schools are too often just wild. And there are too many parents that are more than happy for this to be the case because the kids are off their hands for a few hours each and every day. And if you don't believe me, what about the OECD? The overarching group that has a look at all sorts of things like the performance of discipline in Australian schools. We got an interesting read in the Sydney Morning Herald over the weekend. I didn't get a chance to talk about it last night, but it now starts to talk about what is going on in our classrooms. Anxiety, ADHD, snowplow parents, and a snowplow parent is someone who just ignores whatever the teacher says and always says little Johnny and little Jessica, oh, they're perfect, nothing could ever be wrong. Our classrooms are currently in a world of pain. The article reads, the reasons are myriad. Complications of technology such as social media fights, bullying, is spilling over into schools. The lingering effects of the COVID-19 lockdowns. Oh, sorry, should I mention the ones in Queensland again? With the Sheila who spent $30,000 on a pool covering at Government House. While the kids that she kept out of school because of COVID, that we learnt by mid-2021, and we certainly knew by 2022, was not what people were afraid of at the start of the whole thing. Again, it continues. The effects of the COVID-19 lockdowns on social development. Thousands of kids haven't even gone back to school. Scanned resources to deal with skyrocketing diagnoses of things like autism, anxiety, ADHD, and a crisis of adult authority. Underline that, crisis of adult authority. One expert described it as a more diverse social landscape than ever before in which children bring wildly differing family norms to the classroom. The bit that I said to underline was about the role of the parent. Now, I'm not suggesting we need to bring back the cane, but I do suggest that we need to re-establish the idea that when the kids are told by the teacher they've done something wrong, your job as a parent is to back in the teacher. Not to say, oh, well, no, we'll question the authority, we'll appeal it to the head of the department, then we'll appeal it to the principal, then we'll just ignore the principal, and you did no wrong. Because the lesson that these kids learn is that if there's always a way out, then there'll be a way out when they get into life. It's why so few, or so many, I should say, people can't deal with anything like negative feedback in the workplace, let alone the social disorders, the assault numbers that happen all the way around the country. Again, I need to continue reading this. It's a great read. I'll post it up on the socials. Parents used to back schools when it came to discipline. Some still do. I know I do. But others don't and will believe their child's version over the teachers or complain about the unfairness of consequences, something teachers say is more common in wealthier areas. What a surprise we know that about the wealthier kids, where there's more snowplow parenting, which is trying to remove obstacles facing their children. One principal tells of a mother who offered to sit her child's detention for her. Another says that students use their mobile phones to text mum and dad straight after ticking off. And within minutes, the parent calls the school and undermines the school authority. That's the reality of our schools. That does not take billions of dollars to fix. You need a strong system that does back in the teacher. You need to cut off some of the avenues that parents are using to be able to say, oh, my one's perfect, it's everyone else. It's misinformation on the internet. It's madness, it truly is. But I'm pleased to see a good read, and I'll, again, post it up on the socials. A couple of quick ones before we're done here. David Crucifulli is the opposition leader in Queensland. I hope he's the next Premier. But some of the people around the LNP look like they're about to make the same mistake they made at the last state election and one they've made previously in federal elections. Anastasia Palaszczuk and her government deserves to go. Go on, see you later, don't look back. Goodbye. Well, apparently they're now considering the idea of preferencing the Greens over Labor because it will end up stealing Labor seats. Well, the reality is they don't become Liberal seats. They become part of a coalition that will end up propping up the Labor Party. The Greens should go last in the Queensland election and every damn election. Oh, and remember when Labor people were saying this about the former Qantas boss, Alan Joyce?
Qantas treated their workers reprehensibly.
The revelation that Qantas considered paying back $1 billion worth of JobKeeper but decided not to, I think is a real, it is pretty disappointing.
But Qantas is a company that has been using the labour hire loophole in a pretty extraordinary way.
So when there was an opportunity to call the former CEO back to the Senate to give more evidence about the failures of his time as the leader, guess what happened? He's not coming back, and it's not because he's taking care of Mum in Ireland. It's because the Labor Party voted together with the Greens and the crossbenchers to make sure that he is no longer accountable, does not have to come back. So what does that really show about how they were truly invested in that issue? Reality? Naught, zero, zip. And a bit of news from overseas. Do you remember the lawyer Sidney Powell, the one who promised to release the Kraken to show that the 2020 US presidential election was affected, stolen, voting machines, all of that business? All of it, of course, BS, not true. Well, Sidney Powell spent plenty of time with Donald Trump, including in and around the days after the election and the dying days of his presidency. And she's got plenty of stories to tell about Donald Trump. Now, she was caught up with a whole bunch of others about what the Trump plan was in the state of Georgia when it came to their election results. Well, she's gone through the courts faster than anyone else. She's pled guilty. She's going to cop 4/5 of bugger all punishment. And why? Because she is now flipping. She will now be a prosecution witness who has been in the Oval Office, in the room and on the front lines, which is why CNN might be right when they're actually saying this.
The gold-plated walls around former President Trump appear to be closing in on him. First, former Trump attorney Sidney Powell of Release the Kraken fame flipped on Trump in the Georgia election subversion case. And now Wisconsin's own Kenneth Chesbrough also took a plea deal.
Watch this space. Plenty to fire up about. We'll do so next. Quick break. Back with more. You're going to get a voice whether you wanted it or not. Will that have new tears for the Prime Minister, but not in the red dirt? We'll talk about that and a whole lot more. The Governor of Queensland spent $38,000 on a pool covering, while 3.7 million Australians, their households couldn't put food on the table. Talk about priorities, feeding. I think you can tell I'm fired up tonight, which means we're in for a good one here with Caroline Marcus, our dear friend here at Sky News, fellow Sky News presenter and part of the family, the wonderful Steve Price, and he's part of our family too, even though he's the Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne, because you drop his name, free parking tickets. It's a great deal you've got. Just say it to your local officer, the great Nicholas Reese. Take that one to the bank. All right, so this group of Indigenous leaders, we don't know whether this was the progressive no that was playing nice with yes, or whether this is the yes core that is now starting to move somewhere else. They tell us, despite the fact Australia voted as strongly as they did, you get a voice anyway. Now, obviously, it doesn't have legal standing, not in the Constitution, but the Prime Minister turned around and has said previously in the past, and I think this is one of the reasons that it started to fall, was that it'd be a brave Prime Minister to go against their advice. Now, well, there's no restrictor plate on, and it's going to be wild.
Well, why did we just spend almost $500 million then? If there was going to be a voice anyway, and I know it's not enshrined in the Constitution, but if it's just an advisory body to government, then surely That could have just been legislated.
Well, they're going to become a self-appointed
pain.
lobby group that are now going to end up being the lobbying group element of what Lydia Thorpe is trying to talk about, which means either some of the people who said that they were all up for a moderate version of this, it's going to be a lot wilder. I base it off their language.
Yeah, but some of the language that we're seeing in the draft statement is very concerning. I note the word occupation that you brought up earlier. I mean, they're co-opting the language of Hamas sympathisers now. I haven't really seen that word being used previously when talking about Indigenous.
Well, again, that language is at the very fringy Lydia Thorpe stuff, where she has talked about it before. But to mainstream it in that fashion, you're correct. Particularly at this time, it's a very deliberate use of language. Nicholas, again. I understand they wanted something, they didn't get what they wanted, so now they're going to go off and do their own thing. But you know and I know the Prime Minister's not going to ignore it. The Prime Minister's not going to turn around and say, oh, sorry, it's not officially sanctioned. It's going to end up becoming some sort of a lobby group that the Prime Minister, by his own words, would be brave to go against. And it seems a lot wilder than what you voted for a couple of weeks ago.
Look, Paul, there is a lot of hurt out there in Aboriginal Australia at the moment, and so I don't know that now is the time to be firing up about the first idea that's come back post-referendum from Aboriginal leaders. I think now is the time to listen and say, yep, we're up for a conversation, because we all want to find a way of
what the terms of that conversation
forward. And so, you know, I'm trying to go to the approach we take here, and let's see what comes out of the conversation, because we do need to keep talking. I will make the point again that, you know, here in Victoria, we have a First Peoples Assembly. You might call that a voice. We wouldn't use the V word anymore, but First Peoples Assembly, it's working perfectly well. They're actually working through a truth-telling process at the moment. It's not easy, but it's the reports I hear from people involved in that process is it's going well, and ultimately they're working towards a treaty. And I think that would be a good thing, and we don't need to blow up about it. We just keep working calmly, having the conversation.
Yeah, but this is the confusing
how that
to go, isn't it? Hang on. We've got an Indigenous court here now. Nick, does that work?
Yeah, we've got a youth court.
You've got truth-telling, you've got a voice. Why the hell, as Caroline said, did we go and have a referendum when all of the state administrations around the country are doing this anyway?
Correct.
Well, what a waste of time. We split the country in half. We caused racial division. We've got people who won't even put their name on a letter today calling me a shameful racist.
Correct.
And they weren't game to put their name on the letter.
So I didn't know that, Steve.
What do you mean you didn't know?
Well, I didn't know that, and obviously I don't condone that. I'm just trying to say there's a lot of hurt out there at the moment, and now's not the time to go firing up about some of these things.
Yeah, we're not the ones making claims about
on the
shameful
states,
racists.
though, that's one of the great
Correct.
things about Australia. We've got the states. They're laboratories of democracy. If something doesn't work somewhere, it won't continue. If it does work somewhere else,
Dan
it spreads.
Andrews' laboratory of democracy.
Yeah,
You're
correct.
kidding.
But Steve, also, you know that in Victoria, part of their Truth-Telling Commission turned around and suggested a completely separate child protection system for Indigenous kids, completely separate juvenile justice system. And again, linking back to this letter, which is the first significant communication after a week of going back and dealing with things, was we do not want for one moment accept that this country is not ours. Goes on to say that the legitimacy of the non-Indigenous occupation in this country requires that recognition should be not them asking for it. Instead, it should be, frankly, the systems of white people be the ones asking them for legal standing, etc., etc. The whole point is exactly as I predicted, and this was going on for months, and this is why the question should have been split. It's why the referendum should have been delayed. But the Prime Minister was playing for a spot in Wikipedia history. But the reality is that now the Lydia Thorpe version of let's go back to we must deal with day one is going to ruin things for the next few years.
Yeah, that letter's based on criticism of colonisation. So where are we? After all of this division, all of this debate, all of this money, we're back to where we started. There's no positive step forward. Now, I've got great admiration for our friend Nick here. I would have thought, Nick, that, you know, given your political background, you would have been advising the people that were in charge of the Yes campaign to say, listen, guys, we lost 60-40. We've got to come up with a different way to bring fellow Australians with us who didn't come. Surely that's what they should be doing, not posting a 3-page letter calling us all who voted no shameful racists. They should be coming out with, stretching out their hand and saying, yeah, we're hurt, but how can we work this out together, mate?
Well, I think you got to the nub of it there. There's a lot of hurt there at the moment, and there's a lot of anger as well. And I think it's for all of us to be the bigger Australians and try and find ways to bring us together. So I think you made a great there. Paul, you made a great point there, and I want to get behind it.
Same-sex marriage saying, we won't do it in our churches, we will turn on. What would the reaction be? We would quite rightly turn around and say, no, democratic decisions mean that's the law of the land. The democratic decisions mean that this won't be the law of the land. That's my point here, Nick, which is that I understand the hurt. I respect the hurt. I'm not putting the boots on, right? But I am talking about this idea about you accept a democratic outcome or you don't. And at the heart of this statement, sorry, Caroline, is that they don't.
I think that also saying that Australians are racist because we don't recognise people in our constitution, when clearly the question was not
100%.
Simply about that, and 100%. That was a choice, a deliberate choice they made. Had the question just been about recognition, it would have got up virtually unanimously. But they put in there this question about an advisory body, one yes person said one thing, another yes person said another thing. They couldn't get their stories.
Well, and there's all this bulltish that it was 60-40, everyone was in favour, and then the evil Liberals got involved and it flipped the other way around, despite the fact the Liberal Party, of course, does not hold government federally, does not hold government in New South Wales, in Victoria, in Queensland, in Western Australia, in the Northern Territory. It only holds on in Tasmania. Fair dinkum. I mean, come on. Anyway, I want to move to something else because, we clearly did that for months and months and months. And I didn't expect to be leading off, but here we go. That's where we were today. The politics of cost of living. Steve, as long as you and I have had access to a microphone, we know that what people pay for things matters. And when we start to see the signs that we have, about 3.7 million households that can't put food on the table. I love Food Bank, but I didn't need Food Bank to tell me that. You know it. You know the stories already. The Senate inquiry into cost of living that, again, I mentioned. People trying to keep frozen, keep ice in their car so that when it melts, it can be turned to drinking water and they can use it to refrigerate what little food that they have, let alone, again, Petrol, which is now surging about 13.9% on inflation, that's its inflation number, 3 times higher than the 5%, means it'll feed into the inflation number that the Reserve Bank's already said they're looking at interest rates again. The Prime Minister could tomorrow organise more money for Food Bank. Oh, but he's got a $20 billion surplus. He can't. He could cut fuel by 25 cents because now they care about the cost of living. I don't know, but you can't ask me about that because I'm overseas.
Yeah, it's time to get that fuel excise thing sorted out. I mean, we're hearing anecdotal stories here, and look, I don't know whether they're true or not, but I've heard enough examples of it, and Food Bank were saying this again today, that you've got kids in school who are ducking out, going to the bathroom as an excuse, and raiding the school bags of schoolmates to get food out of the bag so they can eat some lunch themselves, because mum and dad can't afford to put food in their lunchbox at school. Well, what sort of country are we living in when we get to that point? I mean, cost of living, we wasted 3 months on the referendum and cost of living was never mentioned. Cost of living is the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 issue that we have to work out and have to sort out. We can't have Australians who, as Food Bank said today, earning up to $95,000 a year as a household, and they can't afford to go and buy proper food for themselves. They're resorting to going to Macca's and buying, a Big Mac for the kids instead of being able to go and buy some meat to put on the table. I mean, where are we as a country if this is not the major issue? And where is the government? I mean, Anthony Albanese has to travel, but who's out there today talking about this? Where's Jim Chalmers? Where's everyone else on that front bench saying this should be our priority?
100%. I mean, look, the writing orders after the Voice was, it's all about cost of living, Caro. That was going to be their focus. Again, no decision when it comes to fuel. Again, they've got the extra money. And in particular, when it comes to things like Food Bank or even being able to put on breakfasts and lunch for kids at school, that's where you put $450 million, not into a question that you knew was going to come up as no for about 6 months now.
I know. Or at least put the $450 million if you want to help Indigenous kids who can't afford meals, even before the cost of living crisis started. Absolutely. And is it any surprise? I know you've been banging on about it. I've been banging on about it. The Voice has distracted the government from the issues that actually concern most Australians. Like an advisory body for a small group who has had representation in Parliament and other advisory bodies, which haven't made much difference, is not at top of people's priorities.
Well, interestingly, we're seeing some polls up on the screen now.
Paul,
hang on.
I'd be interested to ask Nick,
please,
about. I mean, he's Deputy Mayor of Melbourne. I mean, clearly, Nick, you're seeing evidence of people's families struggling and going along to food banks to get food. You're seeing more homeless people on the streets of Melbourne. What are you hearing anecdotally about how hard it is for people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we actually did a survey across the city of Melbourne not so long ago and found that 20% of people living in the municipality were experiencing food insecurity. So I've got to be honest, my first reaction was I didn't believe it. I was like, questioning the way the survey was undertaken, how reliable was the data. And then when we unpicked it, found it was absolutely true that people were skipping meals to save money because the household budget was stretched so much. It's also the case in the city of Melbourne. We've got a lot of international students, a lot of young people, and so there's particular challenges that are faced by people in those cohorts. But it's a big issue in the city of Melbourne. It's a huge issue out there in suburban Australia. And I don't think in the state parliaments and the federal parliaments, they've quite woken up to the scale of what's going on.
Well, and the thing is that whoever is the politician who promises free everything for everyone is going to be able to make something of this. But I'm saying when you've got $20 billion surplus, you can afford some one-off here, there and everywhere, right? Immediate support for food bank, immediate support for schools to be able to feed kids would be where I'd start. I'd also get onto the fuel excise thing, which, OK, turns the 20 into 15, maybe even into 10. But people are truly hurting right now. And just, briefing to a few people in the gallery, we get it, doesn't actually show they get it, all right? Meantime, about some of that political fallout, I noticed that the Morgan poll, which you don't hear about all that often, it's currently saying that after the Voice and this cost of living situation, two-party preferred right now is the Coalition at 50.5 to Labor's 49.5. I know that's in search of a headline, but that is going to send a shiver up a few lefty spines. Quick break, back with more. Germany, after taking in 1 million people from parts of the world that you wouldn't expect to go to Germany, well, now the boss of Germany is saying time for a lot of them to go home. And he's not talking about Berlin. More in a sec. Thank you so much for watching. Today is a very special day, particularly if you're a tech head like me, or at least like playing with adult toys. You get it. Well, I'll mention that in a few moments' time. The people with dirty minds include all three of our panellists here, because I'm not talking about that. Caroline Marcus, Steve Price and Nicholas Rees. Shame on you for even thinking it. Now, let's talk about what's happening in Germany. Now, obviously, Angela Merkel at one point in time took in 1 million refugees, largely from places like Africa. There's been much violence that has taken place since. However, there's also been quite a significant political change in the types of things that are happening on the streets. The current Chancellor is now saying those who are not likely to be granted permission to stay in Germany because they cannot claim a need for protection must go back. I'm not entirely sure how they're going to be able to move hundreds of thousands of people back, and I don't think anyone wants the image of the Germans being involved in that process anytime soon. But it is interesting about how the world, at one point in time, there have been certain people who've said, open the doors from wherever you come, that's the way it is, we're the rich countries, we have to take care of you. But it does change the countries. Now, obviously, the extreme majority of people who come here under legitimate refugee circumstances aren't the problems. But you do see, and we've seen it of recent weeks in Australia, certainly now we're seeing it in Germany here, that there's the concept of assimilation doesn't quite work for everyone who was given the golden ticket of coming to the Western world. Caroline.
Absolutely. I think it's tough because obviously we do have responsibility to help where we can when people are genuinely fleeing persecution and war. But on the other hand, if their values do not align with ours, if they are opposed to Western values, if they have a deep hatred for other sorts of minority groups, and I think we know what we're talking about here, what I'm referring to here. And in the case of Germany, in 2015, most of their immigrants came from Syrians fleeing the war, and Afghans were the second biggest group. And then what happened just a few months after that, on New Year's Eve, they had mass sexual assaults and rapes of women on the streets of Cologne. This was immediately following what their immigration intake.
Correct.
I think that it's all well and good to be idealistic about this stuff, but we have to be practical and ensure that people here are safe as well.
Well, Nicholas, in part, this is why the temporary protection visa conversation was there, which is that, yes, for a certain group of people, there is going to be a level of limbo. And as soon as, OK, you're not going to be able to deport somebody because of a thought crime or what's being chanted on the streets, but you're able to use the immigration status to be able to say, sorry, you out. Now, again, let's just save everyone the explainers. We all, of course, understand we're talking about an extreme minority here, but still, when you've got that extreme minority that is amongst, you have to deal with it, right? How do you deal with it? And again, I'm not entirely sure the Germans are going to be able to move hundreds of thousands of people. I'm not sure that's going to be happening anytime soon. But what are your thoughts?
Look, we could do a whole episode on this. It's so fascinating. So remember, Olaf Scholz is the German Chancellor. He's from the Social Democratic Party. They're the main left-wing political party in Germany. Over the last decade, 2 decades, Northern European parties of the left have not done very well in elections, mostly because they just get killed on immigration. Interestingly, the left-wing parties of Denmark, Sweden have now gone quite hardline on immigration and asylum seeker, and electorally are performing much better than they have. The German parties of the left, like the parties of the right in Germany, have not made that step. Germany, for historical reasons, has continued to be very generous in allowing asylum seekers from a number of different countries, but Syria, Afghan in particular, to come and settle there. But their policy, their immigration system works differently to ours. They arrive on essentially temporary permit visas, and they can essentially stay for as long as they like, but they never become, or they don't become citizens. Now, what Scholz has done over events in seemingly Israel, it would seem, and what's happening in Gaza, all those terrible events, is use this as an opportunity to change the policy tack. And the people who he's looking like he's going to try and ask to leave are the 1 million that came back in 2015. That's mostly the Syrians. So that will be very, very interesting to see how it plays out. Of course, in Germany, the number one issue is immigration and asylum seeker, and people want to see a much tougher line from their government. And now Scholz looks like that's exactly what he's going to do.
Steve, last one. It's a random one, but I'm going to talk about it every night, so here's the chance to do it. Federal government wants to censor the internet. Oh, we're going to go after misinformation. Censor the internet sounds a lot different than the weasel words being currently used, but if the effect is you can not see what the government does not approve, that's censoring the internet, right?
Raise it every night of the week that you want to, Paul, because it's a really important issue. I mean, we see the word disinformation thrown around even in that 3-page letter that was sent out today by the people who lost the referendum, the Yes campaign. So we've got to be tough on this. We've got to say that freedom of speech is something that we hold close to our hearts in this country. We need to be able to say what we like, even if we don't like what we hear. And to let the government, and they tried to do this under the previous Labor administration, under Rudd Gillard Rudd, don't let them do it. We need to be able to speak freely in this country.
No campaigns say they're going to be arming up against this, but I'm not entirely sure they'll be able to work over the crossbench the way they were able to successfully connect with the people of Australia, but let's all watch together. Thank you, guys. Do appreciate it. Talk to you again next week. So, I said there was a big day for tech. I'll tell you what it is next. On this day, the world changed forever because it was the first time the iPod was released by the great Steve Jobs. It had incredible power. It had 5 gigs and 1,000 songs. Of course, now your average iPhone's about 130 gigs and a whole lot more. Mostly apps that you forget to delete, or just games kids make you buy and you forget you keep paying for them. Thank you, Apple.